Hello there and welcome to the channel. I'm Dr. Tom Pepper and today I'm going to be looking at the arguments for and against the firing of Gina Carano from The Mandolorian. So I'm not going to focus on any particular debate or debaters today. I'm just going to try and break down the arguments into premises and conclusions. I'll bring them up on the screen here, just laid out in proper logical form so you can see what the general arguments are, and then I'll plug in different reasons for the firing and different principles behind the firing as we go, to see if there is any way to formulate the argument that supports the idea that Gina Carano should have been fired from The Mandalorian. It's just going to be a technical video showing you how all argumentative structure works using the example of whether or not Gina Carano should have been fired. I take it we all know the story by now. Gina Carano made a post, we'll go into the details in a little bit later, on Twitter or Instagram, but social media, in which she talked about political persecution and compared it to the persecution of Jewish people during the Holocaust, and she was shortly after let go from The Mandalorian. Now, I do want to make a technical note. I think, in truth, her contract was not renewed because of this, so technically she wasn't fired. She just didn't have a contract picked back up. But since she didn't have a contract picked back up expressly because of this, and Disney released a statement to that effect, I'm going to ignore that distinction. I think if it was anything else, if someone had had their contract not renewed because they were gay, for example, or trans, I don't think anyone would be splitting hairs about whether or not they were fired or had their contract run out. So I don't think it's a very serious distinction, and I'm not really going to entertain it here. So with that said about the way, let's have a look at an argument for firing Gina Carano broken down into proper logical form, that is premises as opposed to support a particular conclusion. So I take it that all arguments for firing Gina Carano will essentially follow this formula, right? Which is premise 1, Gina Carano did X, something, it's a variable just like in maths. Premise 2, anyone that does X should be fired, and that supports the conclusion Gina Carano should have been fired, right? So you establish what she did in the first premise, and then the second premise is establishing the principle, and the conclusion is just saying, well, given that she did break the principle, it follows logically that she should have been fired. So what we need to do is solve for X, essentially. We need to find out what the variable here is supposed to represent. So let's make the obvious assumption first and say that it was about the post regarding the Holocaust, okay? Disney's statement did say, let me just read this out here, her social media posts denigrating people based on their cultural and religious identities are abhorrent and unacceptable. So they do seem to be getting at something like this. They use post plural, and we'll get into that more in a second. But for now, let's assume it is about the Holocaust post. By the way, just so we know what we're talking about here, I'll just read out her post as well as in full. Jews were beaten in the streets, not by Nazi soldiers, but by their neighbours, even by children. Sad emoji. Because history is edited, most people today don't realise that to get to the point where Nazi soldiers could easily round up thousands of Jews, the government first made their own neighbours hate them simply for being Jews. How is that any different from hating someone for their political views? One thing to note here is that although she doesn't actually mention right-wing people being persecuted, that's what it's been taken to mean, which I think is totally fair. I mean, if I was going to be a lawyer, I could say something like, oh, it's not clear who she's talking about. It's just a post against political persecution, and who could be angry with that? I mean, based on her other posts and her personality, I think it's pretty clear that she's talking about right-wing people being persecuted in America or the West more broadly, and comparing that to Jewish people during the Holocaust, who obviously were rounded up and killed in their millions. So once we've plugged in X in premise 1 and found out what she did wrong, we need to plug in X for premise 2 as well and see what the underlying principle is for which she was fired. So let's go through some options here. Firstly, the thing that people seem to be making the most fuss about is that the analogy is really, really bad and really, really off. Now, that is completely true. I mean, the persecution of right-wing people or any people in the West at the moment for political views is nothing at all like the persecution of Jewish people during the Holocaust. That's clear. But is this principle really supposed to be that Disney fired her for making a bad analogy? It seems like a really strange way to say that it's just not true that that's what she said, and she's being fired for saying something that's not true. The interesting thing here, of course, is that Pedro Pascal, her co-star in The Mandalorian, he also made a series of tweets, well, not a series of tweets, I shouldn't say that. He made one tweet just outright comparing Trump supporters to Nazis, saying, he sort of swastika saying lost in 1945, and then a MAGA hat saying lost in 2020, so that's about as clear as you can get. He's calling Trump supporters Nazis. And he'd also made another post, I believe, I'm not entirely sourced this, but I believe showing Mexican people on the border and comparing that to the Holocaust. Those are both terrible analogies, so why wasn't he fired for them? So although people are talking about how terrible an analogy this was a lot, it doesn't seem to have much logical force because no one's really saying you should be fired for making a bad analogy. And if you had been allegedly fired for making a bad analogy, we'd have to ask why Pedro wasn't also fired if this is supposed to be Disney's guiding principle. So if she wasn't fired for a bad analogy, we can plug in something else for premise 2. We can just say, well, she was fired for the Holocaust post, but it was a different principle. It wasn't the principle of bad analogies. It was a principle of trivializing or denying the Holocaust. So in this case, I have to very specifically say that this second premise just doesn't apply here. So if premise 1 is Gina Carano made that Holocaust post, and premise 2 is you should be fired for trivializing the Holocaust, and the conclusion is Gina should have been fired, I say that's an invalid argument. The premises don't support the conclusion because Gina's post didn't actually trivialize or deny the Holocaust. It wasn't an example of that. So the Holocaust denial thing, I've heard one or two people say, it seems obviously untrue to me. Like, she brought up the Holocaust as a real world event to compare it to. So I don't see how that can be Holocaust denial. She obviously thinks the Holocaust was a very bad thing. That's why she's bringing it up and that's why she's pointing it out. She seems to me to be way over-exaggerating the persecution in the West compared to under-exaggerating what happened in the Holocaust, which I don't think she is doing. So I don't think it's a valid argument. And secondly, of course, again, even if you do think that her post was trivializing the Holocaust, you'd also presumably have to think that Pedro Pascal's tweets also trivialized the Holocaust. And that again makes it look like P2 isn't actually doing the work, right? The argument is just misleading because that's not the principle Disney is actually working from, or Pedro Pascal would have been fired too. So is the principle they're working from simply that she offended people, which is certainly true. This did offend people. Again, that doesn't seem to be the principle that they can be working from because Pedro Pascal's tweets would have offended, 80 million Americans voted for Trump, and he called them all Nazis. Like, I assume that's going to offend a lot of people too. So it doesn't seem like she was fired for offending people. Also worth noting that Pascal's tweet directly and deliberately offended people, and Gina's really didn't. She's not calling anyone out in the tweet, except for people who persecute either Jewish people or people because of their political persuasion, which seems fair. Pascal just attacked like 80 million Americans in one fell swoop. So if the principle is supposed to be deliberately offending people, then you really have to ask why Pascal wasn't fired too. Ultimately then, it seems like plugging in the Holocaust post into premise 1 just can't support the conclusion here, especially when it's put next to what Pedro Pascal did, because it either seems like she didn't do what she's accused of doing, so yes, she did the post, but no, it's not Holocaust denial, or it seems like that's not actually the principle Disney is working from, since someone else did the exact same thing, or worse, really frankly, and didn't get fired for doing it. So is there anything else we can plug into premise 1 to try and make this argument work? Well, some people have said she has a long history of abusive posts or bad posts. I've looked through them, and with one exception, they're really, really mild. I know people have been fired or let go or whatever, some weird stuff in recent years, but it can't be anything like this. Regarding election integrity, she just wants to make sure there's no cheating, which seems fair. She tweeted some stuff about masks being silly, which okay, doesn't seem like a firing offense. She said something about Epstein not killing himself, or made a post that referenced that essentially, and I think a lot of people don't believe the official Epstein story, so I'm kind of cool with that. So she seems to put out general right-wing and conspiratorial views. So now I want to turn to the one post that I thought could legitimately be classed as offensive or deliberately offensive. I'm not even sure if it was a particular post or something she did in her Twitter bio, but I think she listed her genders as beep, bop, beep, which is obviously a mocking reference to the new gender ideology where everyone has to list their pronouns. She's clearly making fun of that in a way that she at least knew was going to offend people, and she obviously didn't care about offending people because she did it anyway, or she thought that it was funny and worth doing, or whatever. So I'm actually kind of surprised Disney kept her on after that. So if we plug in, she was fired for the transphobic tweet, and the principle is that you shouldn't be transphobic, then I'd have to disagree with premise 2 and say that's not sound. If we're going to define transphobic as putting beep bop beep in your bio and you think you should be fired for that, like, no. Ultimately, I don't think people should be fired for putting beep bop beep in their personal private bio, which is not controlled by Disney and not owned by the company. It's just hers. It's also important to note that Disney aren't saying they fired her for the transphobic tweet, but they're also not saying they fired her for the Holocaust tweet. So if she's been fired for a series of posts, then these are the two that could even be up for contention for firing her, as far as I'm concerned. And I still don't think that both of them put together are a justifiable reason to fire someone, like making a bad analogy with the Holocaust and kind of making fun of gender pronouns, which, let's face it, lots of people do. That doesn't seem like enough to claim it's anti-Semitism or transphobia to the level where a private company gets to fire someone and take away their livelihood. So given that we've so far failed to satisfy this formula, let's see if there's something really going on here, which I think is what a lot of people suspect. Is it really just the case that Gina Carano was right-wing or a conspiracy theorist, and she was fired for being right-wing or a conspiracy theorist because Disney don't like, at the very least, openly right-wing or openly conspiracy theory-minded people on their payroll? If we plug it in like this, then the problems become obvious. Premise 2 just isn't sound. It isn't true. You shouldn't fire people for being right-wing or for being conspiracy theorists. It's nothing to do with their job, and it's just a personal held belief. So anyone that has any respect for social liberal values should not believe in this premise. And no one is openly supporting it yet. So it's not really an argument that's being made. But like, we all need to be aware, especially next to Pedro Pascal, who obviously made his tweets in furtherance of a left-wing cause, a lot of people are going to be thinking this is the actual logic Disney is following, no matter what they say. I'm going to go into my own conclusions a little more later, but it does to me seem like that's the case. I don't think she was fired for trivializing the Holocaust, or Pedro would have been too. I don't think she was fired for offending people, or Pedro would have been. I think she was effectively fired for offending the wrong kind of people, which are the kind of people that run Disney, and not Trump supporters, which are the kind of people that Pascal offended. No one really cares about offending them at this point. So yeah, I do believe she was fired for expressing right-wing beliefs on Twitter, which Disney weren't happy with. And we'll get into why that's a problem in just a moment. One different way of formulating the argument would be to put into premise 2, to build in a clause that she was only fired because she's a public face of Disney. So like, people see her in Mandolorian and know she works for Disney, and so she is representing the brand in a way that someone stacking shelves or answering phones wouldn't be. So it's like sort of, oh, don't worry, this won't happen to everybody. It only happens to actors in certain roles because they're very visible and represent the brand in some way. So one thing I will address in a bit is that I still don't think, even if you're an actor and you're a public figure, I still don't think that gives private companies the right to fire you based on your expression of your political beliefs. But I'll get into that more in a second. The more important thing is that you have to worry about this kind of thing spreading, right? Like, if you work at Disney, even if you're not visible, are you really going to feel comfortable talking about this kind of thing at work? Are you going to feel comfortable saying, hey, maybe Epstein didn't kill himself, or hey, maybe Trump supporters aren't Nazis? Like, they've made it very clear by not firing Pascal and firing Carano what political views they like to have in their company. So, maybe you won't get fired for expressing right-wing views on Twitter if you're just, getting people coffee at Disney. But maybe you will, and you know very well that your employers, who you know now can fire you for expressing the wrong belief, might do. So that's a sort of chilling effect. Even if no one actually gets fired for expressing right-wing beliefs, people just might not do it in the first place because they're scared. So I do have to conclude that all the ways of formulating these arguments in favor of Gina Carano being fired, I don't think any of them work. I think either premise 2 is not sound, so it's just not a good principle. You shouldn't fire people for doing what she did, or it's an invalid inference. So we've gone from saying, well, people should be fired for being anti-Semitic, so it was a good thing Gina Carano was fired. But it's like, no, she wasn't actually anti-Semitic. I don't know how you're getting there from the post she made. There was nothing offensive about Jews at all in that post. So having concluded that all the arguments for firing her failed, let's take a look at the arguments for not firing her, which I'll go through much more briefly because I think they're good arguments and don't require much criticism. So let's take a look at the formulation for the argument that Gina shouldn't have been fired. So I figured it would run something like this. So premise 1, people should have the right to express political opinions without being fired. Premise 2, all Gina Carano ever did was express political opinions. Conclusion, she should not have been fired. And obviously this conclusion applies to both her and Pedro Pascal, who I think, expressed the political opinion that Trump voters are Nazis. I think that's an offensive thing to say and a dumb analogy, but then I think that what Gina did was also pretty dumb. I just don't think she'd have been fired for doing it. So premise 1 is just a basic component of social liberalism, that people should be allowed to express their political beliefs. Obviously in the past you might face oppression from the state or religion or your own family about expressing your political beliefs. We want to drive towards a point where people feel free to talk. We have the internet and social media now. People should be able to put their views out as much as they like, and yet we feel like we're heading towards a point where our speech is more and more restricted online. So if you want to challenge that part of the argument, you're going to have to come up with an argument against the ability or the right people have to express their own beliefs, which maybe you have. I'm not going to go into defending social liberalism here. It just seems like that's a premise we all want to keep valued, right? Because we certainly don't want to see people fired for expressing left-wing beliefs, right? And who knows where this stops if we start firing people for right-wing beliefs. Rejecting premise 2 seems like the most obvious attack on this argument, to say that that's not sound and that Gina Carano wasn't just expressing her political opinions. She was expressing hate speech or transphobia or anti-Semitism or whatever. But we've already covered that when I was looking at the arguments for. I just don't think anything she did qualifies for something as strong as anti-Semitism or transphobia. And even if it was, frankly, I think there'd still then be a conversation about whether the company has the right to punish her effectively, to fire her for something she'd done that had nothing to do with work. The conclusion you can interpret in different ways. Maybe you can just have it as a light version saying Disney should not have fired her and they had the choice to do it. I'd go with the stronger Disney should not have the right to fire her about this. If they did try and fire her for this, I think she'd be able to take it to an employment tribunal and say it was unfair dismissal. I mean, I'm not sure about the legal terminology, and I'm certainly not sure she'd be able to get her job back or would want it back. But I think she should have a case against Disney here. They should not have had the right to fire her for this. And apparently they do, right? Because basically you have as many rights as you can get away with. So in conclusion then, I don't think she should have been fired for anything I've seen. If there are other tweets I've missed, I apologise for that. Please point out in the comments below. If you think there's anything wrong with the way I put together the arguments, also leave below, preferably with some detail. Don't just say you're wrong, but try and explain why. The worry for me is, particularly in Britain, and I think it's the same in the US as well, that politically this kind of thing isn't going to be stopped. So it's not like the state is going to take away your social liberalism. They just won't defend it from private companies that want to take away your social liberal right to express your political views. The left won't stop it because they're on board with the moral mission of eradicating hate speech, and hey, if some right-wing people get fired as well, who really cares? And the right wing isn't going to do anything because they respect businesses' right to run themselves however they like, which is generally my problem with the right. They talk about freedom all the time, but then when a business takes it away, that's all okay. But that's another topic for another day. Please like the video if you liked it, leave a comment if you have anything you'd like to disagree or agree with, and share it with any friends that you think would like it. If you have any suggestions for topics you'd like me to cover or debates you'd like me to analyse, you can leave a comment down below as well. But thank you very much for watching. I've been Dr. Tom Pepper, and have a good one. Goodbye.